Hello and welcome to Weather and Its Surroundings. I'm Brian Ives. Today on Weather and Its Surroundings, we're going to be talking about extreme weather, changes in our weather pattern, and global warming. Joining me in the studio today is Eric Fisher. Eric is the Chief Meteorologist at WBZ-TV Channel 4. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. We've had plenty to talk about when it comes to busy weather lately.
Oh, absolutely, especially within these past few days, which we'll get to in just a moment. But before we start talking about all of that, let's talk a little bit about yourself first and tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and your background.
Oh gosh, all right, so this is a little embarrassing, I guess. My background is, I was always growing up and I was completely into the weather. When there was a big snowstorm, when there were big thunderstorms coming through, I was that kid who was out in the front porch and had to stare at it and write down observations, had a weather station in the backyard. And I did that in Western Massachusetts. So I'm from Southwick. I grew up in Connecticut after that, went to SUNY Albany for my atmospheric science degree. Spent a few years in Springfield, Mass, one quick year here in Boston, and then went down to the Weather Channel, which was all about chasing storms, and that brought me back up here.
And you certainly get enough weather up here, it definitely seems to be.
Yes, we do.
I'd also like to point out that you ran the Boston Marathon this year. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, what a treat. So my wife went to Holy Cross, and she was a big runner there. And so she has kind of whipped me into shape. When we first met each other, I wasn't much of a runner. And she got me out there, and I did my first marathon in Charleston, South Carolina. And then we moved up here, WBZ being the official station of the marathon. I was able to get a number, raise some money for charity, and we had perfect weather. There were no major issues. It was great.
You must have planned that perfect weather.
Yeah, we put it in order. I thought for sure once I signed up we'd have a blizzard or some freak weather event. Thankfully, it did not happen.
Right. Alrighty, well now we're going to get into extreme weather, which is the whole focus on the show today. I'd like to begin thinking back to 2013, where one storm that sticks out in my mind locally here was that February 2000 blizzard, where most of the state, I think, was dumped with close to 30 inches of snow. Is this the new norm? Can we expect in the winter months to see more crazy snowstorms like this? And I know, forgive me, folks out there, we're talking snow out here. We're talking snow right now.
That's
and it's
a
the
dirty
middle of
word
summer.
right now. We don't want to mention that. I think recent history would show us that no, it's not the new normal, because we had this one incredible storm, which in some ways came very close to even rivaling 78, which is the storm that everyone remembers and everyone talks about. It's the benchmark storm. And when we had Nemo, as so called by some, that was a storm that certainly was disruptive, but we took different types of steps to mitigate issues with that. The governor shutting down roads, businesses basically shut down, and that alleviated a lot of the big problems. But if you look over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, do you remember any other huge winter storms that really stick out as powerhouse destructive storm systems? We've had some really quiet winters mixed in.
I can't think of anything really.
Yeah. Even this last one, Boston, about 56 inches of snow, which is above average, but not incredibly so. It was cold, absolutely. Oh. And I think March was the real icing on the cake for a lot of people. But in terms of major snow in Boston, this year was not it.
Okay. All right. Well, another big talk that's been coming out in the media is about the jet stream and how the jet stream is changing weather patterns. But before we go further, let's explain to our viewers what exactly is the jet stream and how it impacts our weather.
So the jet stream is basically a river of air. If you think about the atmosphere, we're sitting on the ground and we've got nice breezes generally on a normal day. Well, the higher up you go, typically you've got stronger winds. And at jet stream level, which is about 50,000 feet, give or take, depends where you are on the planet, you've got winds that can be up to 200, maybe even 300 miles per hour. And those are the steering currents for all of our major weather systems that come through. So for us in the northern hemisphere, it's going from west to east generally. That's why weather tends to, on average, go from west to east. And where that jet sets up has a lot to do with whether we're hot, we're cold, or whether we're dealing with storms or not.
All righty. Some scientists, so now getting into that, so some scientists now believe that big waves in the jet stream mean more extreme weather. Is this true? Why or why not?
That absolutely can be true. Basically, the jet stream can be either what we call zonal, which means it's kind of flat from west to east, and this is when weather systems are moving pretty quickly and they never get too deep. Or it can be what we call meridional, or basically a high amplitude pattern. So you'd get a big ridge, which is when it goes way up to the north above you, or a big trough is where it dips down to the south. So as we look at the jet stream, and some studies are suggesting that maybe the jet is going to slow down with global warming. If it gets a little bit warmer toward the poles, you're going to make less of a temperature contrast. the temperature contrast is what drives the jet stream.
Right.
So if it maybe slows down a little bit, it takes bigger plunges, it takes bigger rises, it basically undulates more. And if that happens, you've got big areas of cold that come down, big areas of heat that develop, and you've got big storms in between those air masses.
Alrighty. Well, as you mentioned, the big areas of cold air, this relates to our next question, which is this. I think this is I mean, at least to what I know, what I can think of, is a fairly new term from this past winter. The word polar vortex. Here, that got just stuck around here, froze us, never wanted to go away. Well, it is a new term. How does the polar vortex form? And is this now something that's we should expect now every winter from now? It's a continuous thing in the winter months.
I don't want to correct you. The polar vortex has been around, but here's the thing. So it seems like in recent years, especially in the national media,
right,
they've taken some of these words that meteorologists have used for years and years and years and years, or decades, and now they want to use it to give it a life of its own.
Right.
Things like a derecho. A derecho is something that we see, it causes wind damage, and it happens maybe 1 to 3 times a year, possibly. That's a word that's really created a life of its own when it's happening. Polar vortex is another one of those. The polar vortex, and there's actually 2 of them, one in the North Pole, one in the South Pole. They've always been around, and meteorologists have always talked about it. This year, what we had basically was the polar vortex shifting, breaking off, and coming a little farther south. The polar vortex is just a big circulation, and it fences in the coldest of the cold Arctic air, and usually that's up near the pole. But this past winter, it came all the way down at times into the United States, and that helped deliver all of that frigid air. Oh. Now, we've looked across the world, and if you look at a map from this past winter across the world, the United States sticks out like a sore thumb. We were taking it on the chin from all this cold. Meanwhile, the rest of the planet was not that cold.
Right.
And so that's a big part of the dialogue now, is trying to explain to people, yes, we can have a horrible winter here, but the United States is a postage stamp on a very big part of the world.
Right.
There's a lot of real estate, and different things can be happening in different areas.
Alrighty. Let's take a look now. We're jumping around here. We're going to go more recently we're taping today on July 8th. And we just recently had Hurricane Arthur up here that just impacted us this past Friday on July 4th, of all unfortunate days to impact us. It seemed as if maybe I'm wrong here, it seemed like it was more of a potent storm than originally forecasted, becoming a Category 2 hurricane at its peak. Is this something around this time of year that we're going to see more hurricanes? I mean, it doesn't seem like July and June, July, August, in July are obviously are not the peak months. Is this something to look out for, more hurricanes coming around this time of year earlier than expected?
It might be in the next few years in particular. Basically, there have been some studies out, and we're trying to figure out decadal oscillations. Basically, what is a signal to say that weather is going to impact certain parts of the country? One of those is the PDO, Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Right now, you've got a pool of very anomalous water, unusual water that's out across the North Pacific, and when that's in place, we tend to see big drought in the central and western United States. What have we been talking about over the last few years? A lot of big-time serious drought for those folks. Typically also, what we saw back in, say, the 50s into the 60s were a lot of East Coast hurricanes. And there's a bunch of different factors at work here, but there have been some meteorologists and some long-range forecasters out there who have said East Coast needs to be on the watch. We had Sandy, we've had Irene, now we've had Arthur, which was a very unusual storm, like you said, so early in the season. 4th of July, we might never see a hurricane again on the 4th of July coming up past Nantucket.
Right.
Very strange to have happen. So we might need to be a little bit more on guard. Plus, the water is very warm off our coast right now.
Right.
And so that's fuel for those storms.
Of course. All right, so going on top with these hurricanes, there's been a lot of talk. The researchers are saying that New England could see its major hurricane sometime not too far off in the future. Do you think that that major hurricane is sometime soon to bound us and hit us at some time soon?
I do. It's a matter of time. When we look at a lot of these things, people don't like change, and they don't like the idea of change. We all grew up on certain towns, going to certain beaches, and you want to think that situation and that way of life is never going to change for us. But when we look past in history, we know that everything is a matter of time. So we look back to 1938, and that is the #1 hurricane for New England. And you look at how land has changed since then. How many more people are here? How many more buildings are here? How many more boats are here? Mm-hmm. that's going to happen again at some point. It might not be for another 500 years, but it might be next year. And so we try to just give that warning that you need to realize that these are threats. They do exist. Just because it's been 23 years since we've had a hurricane, Bob, doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't have 5 in the next 10 years.
Right.
And so the East Coast is very at risk. People think this recent stretch has been very bad, and it has been for a lot of people. Sandy was just so impactful for many folks, and there have been other storms in between. But the United States hasn't had a major hurricane make landfall in almost 9 years now. You have to go back to Wilma back in 2005.
Right.
And there was a period in the 40s where Florida got hit with a major Category 3 or higher hurricane almost every single year.
Oh my God.
So can you imagine if we get back into that pattern
Oh.
and you've got storms like that coming into a very densely populated area now?
Not something you even
It's a
want
scary
to
thought,
avoid.
right? We've looked back at a storm like Andrew. If that storm came through again now, it would cause over $100 billion worth of damage in one storm.
Wow.
So a force to be reckoned with.
All right, well, we're going to come back to talking about Superstorm Sandy a little while later in the show. But right now, we're going to jump in now to talking about really the rest of the country's extreme weather, and as well as the globe. Specifically looking at this past year, especially with that polar vortex, you look down to Georgia and the Carolinas this past winter, and for a good chunk of times, like, they got hit by a weather that they're not used to down there. They're used to warm weather. They can't handle it like we can up here in the Northeast.
No, they can't. Not even close.
Is this something that is new, that they should be getting used to expect in the winter months to see more?
I think
of
that's
this?
that's a tough call, and this is counterintuitive for a lot of folks who think of global warming and they think, well, everything's going to get warmer all the time, and that's not really how it works. In general, things are getting warmer across the globe. It doesn't mean you don't have extremely cold days. It doesn't mean you don't have record low temperatures. When you talk about a climate changing over time, that's a very gradual line that's going up and up and up and up ever so slowly, but there are fluctuations in between. So you're going to still have cold winters, and there's still going to be cold spots. Can we say really that next year and the year after that in the southeast you're going to be seeing frigid cold air? That's pretty tough to do. And as someone in my profession who is looking at almost, the next 2 weeks, and usually not too far out beyond that, there are long-range forecasters who specifically are focusing on trying to figure out how do we unwrap what's going to happen months in advance, or maybe even a couple of years in advance.
Right.
But is it out of the question? Absolutely not. Even in a warming world, you can still have very big cold outbreaks.
All right, well, that relates right into my next question. I ask this question to every guest usually that I have come on this show if the topic is related to this, and that is the question of global warming. Is all of this related to global warming? Most meteorologists, it's interesting, I will throw out there, that most meteorologists that I've interviewed on the show say it's not global warming, they call it climate change. However, when I interview someone that is an environmental scientist, they call it global warming. What is your thoughts?
All right, so you set me up here. So this is a hot button issue and something I'm sure we'll still talk about for years and years and years. I think that as with many things in life, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. You've got folks on one side who are saying all these things are due to climate change. They're due to a warming world. And then the other side, you've got people saying there's nothing wrong whatsoever, everything's fine, and nothing is changing, and it's all perfectly normal. And I don't think either are true. Somewhere in the middle is where we're going to find out exactly what's going on. There are certainly times we can look back in history where we've had all sorts of severe weather, huge events, and things that have just, look at the 30s in the United States between the Dust Bowl and huge, incredible heat. We had some major hurricanes back then. What if we took the 30s and stuck them now?
Right.
But at this point, it would be media hysteria. I mean, it'd be even worse than it's been lately in the past 10 or 12 years. So I think that you look at human influence and you can't possibly say that we're doing nothing at all.
Right.
We know carbon dioxide is at the highest point in human history. We know that we're putting it there. Is there a one-to-one relationship? No, there's not a one-to-one relationship, I don't believe, between how much carbon there is and how much warming there is. You can look at the chart of temperature versus it, and they don't follow each other exactly. So I do think that land use, population growth, adding some of these gases to the atmosphere that wouldn't normally be there if we weren't putting them, they're probably having an influence. But I don't think that we are the main driving factor. And like you mentioned, I think a lot of meteorologists kind of feel the same way.
Right. Then I guess it seems then, especially nowadays with the media, I mean, one thought, is it the media that's just hyping up on all of this global warming, saying, I mean, because it seems more and more these days that the media is hyping the word global warming, but really when you examine it more closely, like you were just saying, you were just saying there are those signs of it, but is it really more the media hype of it that's getting people more alarmed, would you think?
I'm not sure where that goes. And I don't hear global warming a lot anymore. I hear climate change a lot more than I hear global warming.
Right.
And climate change is it's a duh moment, right? Because the
Right.
climate's always changing.
Right.
And we all know that. And there's no way anyone could ever deny that the climate changes.
Right.
We've had ice ages. We've had all sorts of different cataclysmic events in the history of the Earth. And people weren't around to drive most of those. So I think that anecdotally, you talk to a lot of people. You talk to a farmer in Vermont. You talk to people in Canada. You talk to people in California. And they'll say the weather is different. It certainly has changed for a lot of people. And just as a meteorologist in the past 5, 6, 7 years, it seems like a lot of these records are becoming easier to break, that we are seeing some bigger events. But you also have to understand on the other flip side, and this is the main point I always try to get across with people, is that every storm we would expect to have a greater impact than it's ever had before. And the simple reason for that is there are more people and there are more things in the way of these storms. A drought is going to impact the world in a bigger way now because the world's connected. A hurricane is going to impact a city in a much different way because there are millions more people there, like in the case of Miami. And so every time we see almost the same event, you take a storm from 1850, then put it in 1950, then put it in 2050, it's going to have a bigger and bigger impact, and therefore in the media, it's going to show up as a bigger event each time.
Right.
So it's a tricky line.
Okay, well, as you're talking about all of this severe weather, now I'm going to turn into more of a global scale, and that's particularly looking at the winter it's summer here in the United States. Australia, obviously, is the opposite of that, and I think it's the Australian mountains that have just been getting pounded with unusual amounts of snow. Is there something that attributes to a cause like this? Because I wouldn't think of even the Australian mountain areas seeing record amounts of snow. What?
And that's on the heels of unbelievable record-shattering heat for years in a row in Australia, where they have been on fire and literally huge forest fires, record heat. So a lot of extremes. So I think that globally, it seems that we have locked into a pattern that is a more high amplitude pattern, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
Bigger undulations in the jet stream. It seems like one place is scorching hot, one place is freezing cold. There are big snowstorms and there are big droughts.
Right.
Can we say that this is the new normal? I'm not sure, because we've been down this road before, and there have been times, even in the last 150 years, where we've had these major, huge differences from place to place. It is very peculiar. One thing about the heavy snowfall is that one of the things with global warming or climate change that people talk about is that with more heat, warmer world, you're going to be able to hold a little bit more water vapor in the atmosphere. You're going to evaporate more from the oceans. And if you have more water vapor in the atmosphere, chances are a little bit higher that when you have an extreme precip event, like a big snowstorm or a flood, you're going to have a little bit more snow or a little bit more water, and that can make a big difference.
Exactly. Well, also on that side of the world, especially within these past few days, there is the super typhoon that they're talking about that has formed, which looks pretty crazy. I mean, that they've been getting hit by this type of weather down over there. But what exactly is a super typhoon? This is now also their fourth or fifth major typhoon within the past few years that have hit that area. Is this something just to expect on a regular now to keep hitting in those areas over and over and over again?
A super typhoon is kind of the equivalent of a major hurricane for us, especially when you get up to that Cat 5 status. If you're in the West Pacific, if you're in the Pacific Islands and around Okinawa and off the shores of Japan, the Philippines, it's a fairly normal event to have a super typhoon. There's just way more heat energy to work with there. You've got water temperatures that are routinely up around 90 degrees on the surface of the water, which is warmer than bath water. And so you've got tons of fuel for these storms.
Right.
Usually they do their curve thing, they head on out, they move off to the east of Japan, or they weaken as they move up toward Japan. You can think of Japan actually as New England. Basically, it's high enough latitude where these storms tend to lose some of their characteristics, or they weaken a little bit before they get there. Last year, we had an incredible super typhoon, which is Haiyan, came into the Philippines. That was an exceptional storm. Do I think that we can say we're going to have a Haiyan every year or every other year? that might be a little bit less likely.
Okay. Well,
But I will point out that the people there, out in the Western Pacific, they don't build like people do here in
Right.
America. These islands get hit all the time.
Right.
The Philippines can see over a dozen typhoons in 1 year, but a lot of them will not build $5 million, $10 million mansions on the water,
Right.
expect for them to get destroyed,
Right.
and then call the insurance company and build another house right there.
Right.
It's a little different philosophy, I think, and
Yes.
maybe a wiser one, too.
I would agree with you on that. There has also been a lot of talk recently about changing weather patterns. What exactly are these changes in our weather patterns? What do they mean by that?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by...
I've been reading a lot of reports in regards to, like, I think specifically, which is getting to our next question, which is El Nino, La Nina, the changing of weather patterns, that it's changing a little more frequently. That some are saying it's not. What exactly?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, we talked earlier about, these decadal oscillations, and you go through some periods where the weather is incredibly active and can be incredibly damaging, and then you go through some periods where maybe there aren't a lot of hurricanes, maybe there isn't much in the way of any drought. And a lot of the drivers that we think are really showing encouraging signs of being able to forecast these events
Right.
are in the ocean.
Right.
These are ocean currents or patches of water that might be way above average in temperature or way below average in temperature, and that has a way of driving where the jet stream sets up. The PDO that we've been in, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, might be a very large driver in some of the extreme weather that we've seen. And now we'll watch to see if El Nino develops. There aren't any signs that it's going to be a strong El Nino. We haven't had a strong El Nino
Right.
since 97, 98.
Right.
So we'll see where it goes with that. And that obviously can have a big impact on our weather as well. In particularly the western and southeastern United States see bigger
Right.
impact from El Nino than we do here.
That's what I was hearing, which goes right into what I was about to get into. Anyhow, with the scientists are saying that they're watching for that very strong El Nino later this year. If that, what are some of those changes from a stronger El Nino? Like, I know we've seen it back in '97, like you were saying, but what are some of those changes?
Well, in general, you've got this huge pool of way above average ocean temperature. So that's going to contribute to some of the rankings. When you hear about it was the 8th warmest year globally, or it was the 7th warmest year globally, they take into account land and surface temperatures. So when you have this patch of water, it's going to bring the whole average up and tends to heat up the world. In terms of active weather, it can bring some heavier rainfall to the western United States in the winter, especially the California area down to Arizona. It can bring stormy, cool weather to the southeast. Usually doesn't have a huge impact on us around here. And for hurricane season, if it develops in time, it tends to create a lot of storms over the Pacific. So the good news there is those storms in turn create a lot of wind shear that goes across into the Atlantic and tends to decrease the amount of storms that we see here. Another thing to watch out for with El Nino is that if you look at each year, we've had a strong or moderate El Nino, and then you look at where was it wetter than average, where was it drier than average, and where was it normal.
Right.
There's big variation.
Right.
Just because there is an El Nino doesn't mean the drought's over in California, or the rain is coming, or it's going to be cool in the southeast. There have been years where the exact opposite has been true. In general, you look at the average and it says, okay, here are the impacts, and it seems so easy to just forecast, but in reality, that never ends up being the case.
Right. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into a lot of talk as well has been on the rise in sea levels and storm surges. It has become pretty much a hot topic actually recently, especially around here, which appears only to be getting worse. Well, it seems like maybe here would be the hardest hit areas, but where are there? There must be other areas, and where would those be and why?
I mean, if you're on the coast,
Right.
you've noticed a change. The water is a little bit higher for sure. It's expected to grow a little bit higher on average. The reasons being you're melting some ice in the Arctic. Plus, if the ocean temperatures are warming, think of air. When it
Right.
warms, it expands. When water warms, it expands. It takes up a little more of a volume. And so that's why that water level is climbing a bit. And even just a 6-inch water rise can mean a big difference. When we had Irene come into New York, that water was about 8 to 10 inches from flooding the subways before Sandy. So it wouldn't have taken very much more at all to
Right.
go over the defenses that we have put into place. You look into Boston, Sandy hit quite a ways away.
Right.
It was at low tide, and that water was still awfully close to coming into some very important
Right.
infrastructure. So you add 6 to 10, maybe 12 inches of water on top of that, and you've got a big issue on your hands. And the thing that really stuck out to me the most during Sandy is when we went down to places like Plum Island, or we went into Rhode Island, and people had pictures and postcards of their front yard from just about 5 or 6 years ago. And there was one house owner I talked to. You had the house, and then you had about 30 feet of lawn, then you had a stair down to the dunes, then you had the beach. The beach went out another 30, 40 feet, and then you had the water, and his house was in the water. So that's how much land was lost in just about 3 storms that came up the coast. So living at the coastline is wonderful. I mean, I think all of us have a goal at some point to have the beach house, and it's a wonderful time.
Right.
It's a very dangerous proposition at the same time.
Wow, that's something. While most of the globe has been seeing this extreme weather, it seems like there are still though parts that see their normals and so are not seeing much in change of extreme weather and seeing not much of extreme weather in any cases at all. Would that change? Will that be changing, or could they expect to stay the same and not expect to see much extreme weather?
That's a good question. If you get the answer to that question, then we would be in great shape. We could go forward. Extreme weather has always been here, and it's always going to be here. We're always going to have powerful hurricanes. We're always going to have huge destructive tornadoes. We're always going to have floods. We're always going to have droughts. Will they shift? Most likely in places. One of the spots you mentioned, when we look at a map of the United States and who's warming, the Southeast is actually cooling over the past several decades, just by a little hair, but obviously they're not seeing the same type of impact. And will that shift over time? You know what? That's a question that is extremely difficult to answer, and I'm not sure of it.
All right, well, with our little bit of time left remaining, we've got a little bit of less than a minute left.
Okay.
Yesterday, Boston has issued a tornado warning. It had a tornado warning issued. Because I saw that on TV. I'm like, how often does Boston see a tornado warning? That just...
Around the city, very rare.
Right.
Very, very rare. Usually our ocean air comes in, gets sucked into the storm, and knocks them down a little bit. It was a wild couple of days here. We do get tornado warnings every year. We even get tornadoes every year. But it has been, over the last week, very active.
Right.
And maybe again today. We'll see.
I can't believe it, but we're already out of time for today. I want to thank again Eric Fisher for joining us today. I also want to thank everyone who helped out behind the scenes today. Thank you, Richard Berman, Laura Johnson, Regina Ramsey, Sam Rubel, Bessie Seiler, and New TV. For more information about this program, please visit our weather blog at weatheranditssurroundings.blogspot.com. We are also on Facebook at facebook.com/weatheranditssurroundings, Twitter at NewtonMAWeather, and most recently on Tumblr at weatheranditssurroundings.tumblr.com. On each of these sites, you'll be able to find out more information about each of our programs, forecast outlooks, severe weather alerts should they warrant, and much more. If you have questions or comments about this show or would like to submit ideas for future programs, please email me at brianives@gmail.com. If you missed any portion of this episode or you would like to watch it again in its entirety, please visit newtv.org. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.